All right, thank you, everyone. It is July 22 or 23, depending on where you are. We've got a lot on today's agenda. This is the meeting before the deadline. The deadline is basically 1 week and 1 day before our deadline for this phase of the release. So this is a big meeting. We've got lots to go through and discuss. And then also, I want to call out we need to leave plenty of time because we have some really cool topics that got added at the bottom here. So I just want to make sure we also have time for that. So yeah, with that, let's get right into it. Prioritizing 1.2 discussion because we are a week out. Mike, I think you have a good clarifying question here. Uh, there's a lot of a lack of specificity, I guess I could say, in terms of what we expect to happen here for this. This is the first release cycle where we're trying a very prescriptive and predictable release timeline, and as a result, there are some things that are not clear, including this. So everything about this get freeze timeline was entirely focused on new gaps that were going to experimental. We didn't really answer the question of what that meant for gaps that were going from experimental to standard. Um, I think what we need to do, given the ambiguity in this, is that we should ensure that we have a clear and reliable plan to get to standard in this release cycle by this deadline. And if that plan is not written down, if we don't feel confident that we can hit it, then we should defer the gap. But if we do feel reasonably confident and we have a clear plan and somebody to implement it, I think that's all we need for the standard, the ones going from experimental to standard. That's just my own opinion. Anyone else feel strongly on this one?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the idea here is that the idea of having these phases is that we have this and the end of this phase is when we're intended to sort of have okay, we figured out we figured out what we spent some time and decided what we were going to do for all the things that we're going to do. We now have a plan for how we're going to do them, and now we're going to execute on that plan for the remainder of the release. And so I think it's fine for things like conformance tests don't need to be part of this window for especially for features going from experimental to standard. But we need to have a plan for like what conformance test there needs to be, or like how much conformance testing there needs to be, or something like that. Like we need to have some idea of what the scope of the remaining work is, because if the remaining work is 6 months worth of work, then we can't do it in the remaining time, right? Like that's the point here, is to try and make it so that we can have all of this stuff be a bit predictable, but also so that in the sort of 3 to 4 weeks leading up to KubeCon, we don't have a whole bunch of stuff happening that we end up missing because no one has any bandwidth left because everyone is so busy trying to get their own thing done.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. I wrote a few notes related to that and just a link to the release cycle. Uh, so yeah, I think Nick and I at least are in agreement here. Anyone else happy to jump into? Uh, but what I want to highlight is even if we're not blocking a gap from moving forward because I don't hit a specific requirement at this deadline, uh, it's still going to be tight because remember that the graduation requirement is not just to have the conformance test merged, but also to show that you have at least 3 implementations passing those tests, and that's going to take some time. So yeah, anyways. Okay, any other thoughts on this one? Okay, cool. We can run through the things that are new to experimental. First up, named route rules. Good. No more discussion on this one. That's complete for this cycle at least. The next one, Jake updated this percentage-based request mirroring. I think he's responded to all feedback now. He's added examples. Uh, I think this one, I need to do another round of review on it, but I feel pretty confident about what this looks like. So I think this is just in the needs a bit more feedback category. We've already gotten some good feedback. It's all been addressed. I think this is a pretty small gap, so I'm pretty confident this one can fit in. But if you have an opinion on this one, I would say please raise that in the next day or two. Otherwise, we'll just plan on merging this pretty soon. Cool. Uh, One that is far less straightforward, complete backend MTLS configuration. I know Nick has done, and Mike and Grant, several have done good reviews on this one. Marcin went through this earlier today and did some significant updates on this one. Maybe we could just highlight the points of contention real quickly. Actually, maybe I'll highlight real quickly what he added. One of the concerns, one of the biggest concerns on this PR was adding configuration for client certificate at backend TLS policy level. So basically at service level. And one of his strongest points for that is that you want to be able to either disable or override configuration at a per service level. And the examples he gave were specifically, I have out of the box software that has very specific requirements, and I need to be able to override this at, for this service or set of services that I have very little control over, but I just need to make sure the LB is communicating or proxy in a very specific way with that. So he's proposed adding a mode on the clients, on the backend TLS policy for client certificates. And that would be either default behavior, so just inherit from the gateway, or override, which means whatever is here has precedence, or finally disable, which means do not provide a client cert even if one is requested. Oh, thank you, Dave. I've been calling Marcin, well, the improper pronunciation for a very long time, and he hasn't corrected me, but thank you for it. I don't know if you want, I don't know, Marcin. I probably did that very poorly, but if anyone can correct me, um, yes. Okay, so that's one. Nick, I think you may have had some other concerns on this that maybe I don't know if you've
Yeah,
had a chance to take a
I haven't had a chance to take a look yet. I will have a look. It's, first thing in the morning for me. I will have a look at this later today.
cool.
I do. Yeah, I get. I appreciate the use cases. I do feel like, to me, having a service say, here like here's the CA that you need to use to connect to me, and here's the details that you use to connect to me as well, kind of defeats the purpose of doing MTLS at all to me. But like, I get it. Maybe you might need to do that at some point, but like, it just seems weird to me that
Yeah,
if you're gonna put a lock on your front door, why tape the key to the front door as well, right? Like, you know,
yeah.
yeah, like, I'm like, okay, like, I guess, but I mean, and you're just not going to actually be
Can
getting much value out of
can
TLS.
you? So let's say we ignore this client certificate ref. Can you buy the idea that on a per service level, you want to be able to disable to prevent a proxy from presenting a client certificate if one is requested?
Uh, I guess. But I mean, is that because? Okay, so in that case, you're doing that because you know that the backend service has a different CA to the CA for the client certificate, and you should, I guess, yeah, yeah, that's weird, but sure, Mike.
I think that that's kind of like an inverted solution to the problem versus like I think it would make more sense to define more granularly when that certificate should be presented rather than configuring it on the gateway as a whole and then assuming it's presented everywhere except where a client tries to override and say it shouldn't be there.
And the problem is that if we make the more granular we make the gateway config, the
Yeah.
more repeated config there will be. So if
Yes.
we put the if
Yes.
we put the config into the client config into the listener, that means that every listener that wants to do that is going to have a client certificate presented, which means that you will have a whole bunch of boilerplate that you will need to add into every listener. The reason we want and so we can do that, but again, it's just trade-offs, right? Like and that this is probably like a reasonably acceptable trade-off in the case that we want to have, minimal config for the client part. And I sure, like, maybe you do want to be able to disable that. Like again, yeah. I mean, curl has all those options for a reason. So let me have a look at this today and I'll have a think about it. Yeah. And we'll see where we go. I don't want to take up any more time. We don't have enough time today.
Yeah, that's fine. And Mike, I know well, Microsoft in general has done something like this before of attaching this config at a basically back end or service level. So would be interested in your perspective as well uh, on if and how this fits together. But yeah, that's a long way of saying feedback is very, very much appreciated on this one. I think the fundamentals are pretty sound on this one, but there are some questions about it. Like I think basically gateway specifying this at gateway level, straightforward. Uh, there's a few bits I think are very straightforward, and then just a little bit like whether the client search should be on the back end that is leading to more discussion.
I think the other thing in terms of feedback that would be particularly useful is if anybody has like actual end users that currently have needs for this, like getting that perspective in here would be really valuable so we can understand what trade-offs we should be balancing for.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say uh, we have end users on the GKE side that are looking for this, but their bias is coming from the just using one implementation to begin with, right? So per service configuration is fine because if you're just using the one implementation, okay. But I get that is a little funnier in the broader gateway sense. So and anyone else who has end users, real life people that are wanting to use this feedback would be very useful. Candace, you mentioned Constantine. I'm not sure who that.
Boston,
The,
I would assume.
Oh, yes, sorry, got the name wrong. Costin.
oh, Costin. Oh, yes, I got it. Yes. Um, yeah, that's a good question. I'll make sure that he has seen this.
I mean, yeah, I think the mentions of Spiffy here are literally just to say, hey, Spiffy uses the URL SAN and not hostname SANs. And so if you want to be able to do certs that do Spiffy and you want to be able to do things based on the Spiffy URL, then you need to have a way that you can have the implementation need to check the Spiffy SAN, the Spiffy URL SAN, as opposed to the hostname SAN.
Yeah, this is all built back into the idea of how we defined back in TLS policy originally, that the SNI needed to be what you sent, but also that it needed to be present in the certificate that was provided by the backend. And that's not really compatible if the certificate has a URI SAN. But go ahead, Candice.
I just had a quick question about whether this aligns with the terminology rewrite that you did in the last release. I see a lot of new TLS terminology in here.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should definitely do a cross ref. I
Based
think.
on the
Sorry, I may have frozen. I think yeah, I think we can do a cross-ref with that. I'm pretty sure this lines up. One of the things, for example, that I know did not exist when I wrote that is this idea of a mode. But like the high level pieces, I think the naming lines up correctly, but we should do a double check because I remember before we had a mismatch of ref and reference, and that was less than ideal in field names. So just trying to make sure those details are correct would be very good. Yeah, good call. Okay. So yes, in the interest of continuing to move, I'll keep on moving with that. But thank you to everyone who's provided feedback, and another round of feedback would be very appreciated. Next up is this one that I think is at high risk, is the gateway hierarchy, gateway merging discussion. I chatted a bit with Dave about this today. I think, Dave, you were going to try and get an update out tomorrow or Wednesday on this, but if hopefully I didn't misunderstand you. Do you have anything that would be useful to talk about in this context?
I think for me, because the brainstorming doc, I think, spells out like the sharding of the listeners from the gateway. I think the one change I would want to do is maybe do domain delegation outside of the gateway, but then have the gateway like adhere to those delegation rules. But I might want to write that up a bit because I think there's other useful use cases for domain delegation outside of just sort of like gateway, like the gateway resource as an example.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. I've generally thought of if we can, basically prevent bad actors from claiming domains in namespaces that weren't meant to own that domain. This is particularly true of a multi namespace gateway, or a gateway that spreads across multi namespaces, which is what you get with merging. That was my biggest fear. But I think in a world with external DNS and other things which just give you a domain, point DNS your direction if you ask for it, roughly, that having some kind of higher level authorization or domain ownership concept, it might make sense. My biggest fear is that not to open too much of a can of worms, is that if we allow basically cross namespace gateways, like gateways that end up exploding across multiple namespaces, I feel like we need to have the domain problem solved, the DNS problem solved. So one potential option is we allow gateway merging, or whatever we call this new thing, to exist entirely within a single namespace until we have domain delegation or domain ownership solved for that cross namespace problem. I'm not saying that's ideal, but that's a theoretical solution that could help us separate things out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Nick, you got a hand?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like we can't. I agree that almost certainly you're gonna want to be able to split these things up across namespaces, right? Like it's the object boundary is a really useful place to be able to drop a security boundary, and in Kubernetes, the security boundary people expect to use as namespaces. And so we can expect that it will be that people will want to be able to put a subset of listeners for a gateway in a different namespace to the gateway. That is one of the things that will help people do things like splitting up the config and being able to manipulate the listeners more programmatically and stuff like that without having to have access to the top level gateway. But as soon as you do that, then you run into problems with, but how do I make sure that I'm not claiming host names that I'm not supposed to? And again, this does not address there is a much broader concern, which is that, Should a gateway really be the place where you claim a host name full stop? Probably not. It's the same problem that we have with Ingress, where you can have a namespace resource that claims a cluster scoped thing. A domain name is a cluster scoped thing, right? Like, because you get one, right? Like per cluster. It doesn't matter where it's specified, you only get one. So, but I mean, given that we have an item later on in the list to say, hey, we want to have less cluster scoped things, you know, like having a cluster scope thing that defines where the domain name is also going to be not palatable to some people. So, you know, this is why we need to talk about this level at this level now. And I appreciate that it's really frustrating that we have a bunch of stuff that seems like it's almost ready to go, gateway merging, TLS route, and a few other things that we keep saying like, whoa, you know, like we need to talk about all of these things first. You know, I am also frustrated because like I would like to move forward on a lot of those things, but we can't do that. But we need to stop now, because otherwise we're going to end up with a, you know, organically grown API that makes no sense and is not logically consistent, because we've added a bit here and we've added a bit here and we've added a bit here, and it turns out all three of those things contradict each other, right? And so, you know, it is really I certainly appreciate that it's really frustrating to have to sort of stop and go back and think about all of these things again. But if we don't do it now, we'll never do it, and we're going to end up causing ourselves problems in 6 to 12 months, or I guarantee it. So yeah, so that's why we are doing this. I do want to say this is a brainstorming doc, right? Like we threw heaps of stuff in there, right? Like maybe too much, right? But the idea here is to say, hey, all of these things are things we need to think about. We don't need an answer for all of these immediately, right? Like, but we do need to make sure there's space in whatever we do for the short-term things to solve gateway merging, to make sure that we're not creating more problems for things like, you know, for things like domain delegation, or, you know, generation of listeners, or automatic TLS handling, or all that sort of stuff. And again, that's why we opened the can of worms about simplified layer 4 routing, which again is another thing that we do not have time to talk about today, because that is like an hour's discussion by itself. But the, you know, and the reason I'm saying all of this, because like I just want to be clear that the reason that we're raising this is that we have had feedback from people that, hey, hey, it sucks that in order to do layer 4 forwarding, for example, you've got to have 3 to 4 resources, right? Like where currently you can do that with 1, right? Like I've been here for why we did it that way, right? Like there are good reasons for why we did it that way, but the idea is to just make sure that we're 100% sure that all of those reasons still apply. So again, I don't want to take any more time on this. We don't have enough time to talk properly about this. I have lots of things that I would like to talk to people about this document. So I think maybe we might need to do another dedicated meeting on this front. So yeah, let's talk about that probably asynchronously in the channel afterwards. Because I think this one definitely needs another high bandwidth input, like over Zoom meeting, to work through everyone's concerns, because as it stands, we've got like heaps and heaps and heaps of comments on there. It's already getting difficult to keep track of what's going on for everybody. So I think we need to sit down and work through the things, resolve comments, and talk through people's concerns in a higher bandwidth way than what we have available at the moment with the doc. But I agree that I think there's almost no way that this is going to make 1.2. We will continue talking about it, and we will continue working towards this, but we're not going to get that. That means that TLS route, gateway merging, all of the things that are impacted by this will not make 1.2. Because
do you have an opinion on just simplifying the problem of merging in the same namespace?
I mean,
to me that
seems
feels like
yeah. Sorry, you go.
I haven't thought this through enough, but I feel like if anything were to make it, that would be the thing. It's still going to be very tight, but if you say same namespace, you get to throw away some of the current concerns about multi-tenancy, about like different teams sharing the same thing. Like it gets rid of a lot of concerns. Not saying there's a guarantee there, but it seems like a decent place to focus.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess so. And Candace, I just wanted to acknowledge, I saw your things about distinct listeners and compatible listeners and stuff like that. I will put some So that is all my writing. I will put something in the doc to explain about distinct and compatible listeners and how I see them working with the idea of a listener set later on today, so that we can hopefully move forward there. Again. So the reason that we have stomped the brakes on the TLS route thing is because this has, because we could graduate TLS route to like GA pretty easily, right? Like, but if then we have a way to represent TLS route config, that's way simpler, then we can't. That's it. TLS route is there forever. Now we got 2 ways to do something. And that's what I'm just reluctant to push the GA button until we're 100% sure that approach is what we want to do. And because that approach then has further impact for how we're going to do TCP route and UDP route and so on and so forth. Candice.
Just a quick question. Are there a lot of people who think that the new way that we would be describing TLS route is as easy as the old way we were describing TLS route? Or is it just a matter of there's not a lot of implementations of TLS route as it stands?
I think the biggest thing I've seen feedback for is that these are overlapping concepts. Basically we have some version of SNI matching at the gateway or proxy level, and then we do again at the routing layer, and then you also have TCP routing, which is similar but not quite the same thing. So you have TLS route fits in this awkward space where it's not adding that much. And we just need to be very sure that we're not going to introduce concepts on either side of it that make it irrelevant, right? Kind of what Nick was saying, right? Like if you add more in gateway merging, then you have a resource that sits below gateway that you can have many of that does SNI based routing. Why would you also need TLS route as an example? Or what I've had many people ask me is, why do we have both TLS route and TCP route? Like, isn't that just, pass through? Isn't that just over TCP?
People say the same thing. Like, why is that different? And I have said, because TLS route uses SNI as a routing discriminator tool, I'm literally blue in the face. But but people are like, but I don't care about that, right? Like, and then the fact that we do have support for terminating TLS and using a TLS route, which again is basically just a TCP route with extra steps. And so like that's what we mean by there's a lot of overlapping concepts. I mean, the core use case that we designed TLS route for is I have a wildcard domain. I have a wildcard domain and I want to be able to host a bunch of different services under subdomains under that thing. So different services, one on each subdomain under that thing. And so you have a listener that is star.foo.com, and then you attach a whole bunch of TLS routes that are, domain1.foo.com and domain2.foo.com, right? Like in that case, TLS route it makes the most sense. And if that's the use case that people are mostly thinking about, then TLS route seems like the simplest and clearest way to do this. But the problem is that then we have all of this interaction with other stuff, TCP route, terminated TLS, different TLS modes, and all this other stuff that makes TLS route actually way more complicated than it seems for that use case. And so like, that's why I think that a lot of this, comes down to like, when we say TLS route, what are you thinking of? And that's why we need to talk more about this, is because like, different people again, different people mean different things when you say TLS here. So that's why I think that it's important that we hold off on this. Oh no, I reiterate, I know that it sucks that. So the whole idea here is that the reason for doing listener set, I saw. Thanks, Candice. You said that your TLS route is intended to be used by app developers, and the the alternative proposed is only by cluster admins. The whole idea here is that listener set is intended to be able to be given to app developers, right? Like, because it's a separate resource. Again, this sort of thing is why we need to talk. We need to have a separate meeting about this. We do need to time box this because we're out of time. We've got heaps more to do, and we've got a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, like I will try and tee us up with another meeting. I'll try and talk to you asynchronously as well, Candace, about this, so that we can talk through this, because like I'll try and maybe catch up with you separately, Candace, but we'll see if we can schedule another one. But given that we have till the end of the week, it's going to be tough to make all of this happen in time for anything to be doable here, and that's why we have this marked as at risk.
Yeah, and to be very clear, us doing all this exploration work does not mean that we've ruled out TLS route forever. It means that we know for sure that there's enough uncertainty that we can't bring TLS route to GA in this cycle. That's the only thing we're certain about. There's enough up in the air, enough fluidity that we want to just hold off until we have this figured out a little bit more. That's all. But yeah, with that, as Nick said, we are running out of time. So let me keep on running real quickly here. Request timeouts for gRPC route. Arco was trying to get this in the week before. This week he ran out of time. He's out this week, which means this one is deferred by default unless someone wants to volunteer to take this one up. Remember, you only have a week. This one is, I think, on the simple-ish side because it's basically copying the timeouts we have in HTTP route, making adjustments so they can work with gRPC, and then, moving forward with that. I don't want to make it seem too trivial, but it is a GEP that is looking for an owner in this cycle. So yes, but by default, it is deferred unless I hear otherwise and someone wants to pick this one up. Just ping in Slack if you are interested. The next one, configurable retries. Thank you to Mike. He's got a PR up that I think you classified as mostly ready for review, Mike. Just a couple things left.
Yeah, the biggest open question that I have is around future design space for budgeted retries and whether those eventually belong on HTTP route or not. If we wanted them on HTTP route, I don't see any existing implementations that implement them in that way. So that would be an interesting kind of burden on implementations if we think that's a better UX. So there's some open questions there. And then the kind of implications from that is whether the currently proposed retry stanza needs some kind of typed union discriminator, like a method max count versus method budgeted or something like that. And then there's a few other things worth drawing attention to. Basically recommendations for must type behavior around retrying connection failures and retrying backend timeouts. The intent of that is to minimize the end user facing required configuration so that you have a simpler UX for the most common use cases, including default behavior of many existing implementations. So please take a look at some of those. Looking for feedback at this point.
Yeah, I just want to call out that this is a really well-written GEP, and I remember the first time I looked at this, you may have been Friday, I'm not sure. I was both impressed and disappointed by the lack of overlap in terms of the retry on, terminology, right? Like the fields that I don't even understand. But even if you're not that interested in this GEP, just take a look at the retry on capabilities you can configure in Envoy, Nginx, HA Proxy, and how they're so similar but just painfully different with minimal overlap. It's like timeouts all over again. I don't know. I think you have a good solution here, but just if you're curious in the awful world of proxies and compatibility, here we are. But yeah, thank you for writing this one up. I owe you a review. I'll try and get that in the next day or so. But cool.
Yeah, if would you mind marking that as not draft, Mike?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks.
Cool.
I generally don't look at the PRs until they're not draft because bandwidth.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll add one more thing to the open questions to clarify what I just said, and then I'll move that out of the draft.
Sweet. Thanks.
I
Flint,
should note we need to, Rob, we do need to keep track, however, of how, like, one of the things that will set what things make it in and what things don't is that we have no slots free in experimental at the moment. So if you want your thing, we can finish all of the work for something to move into experimental and not have any slots free, unless some more things graduate from experimental to standard.
Yeah.
We have 2 slots guaranteed here because backend protocol selection and gateway class supported features are on track. But if we don't get timeouts, and the labels and annotations thing in, then we're gonna run out of slots too, and we're gonna have to have some hard discussions about which things make it in and which things don't.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you. That is a very good transition to this next item, which this is a 2-for-1. So please do what you can to help Flynn out on this one. Reviewers, welcome and appreciated. This is basically graduating 2 gaps in 1 because timeouts and the duration format are 2 separate gaps, but they're very closely linked. So if we can help get this one across the line, it will be a win for everyone trying to get new experimental things in. So just heads up, this exists. Flynn is working on it. One of the things he's working on in parallel is adding helpers to Python client, Rust client, and then inside Gateway itself to handle this duration format. And yeah, but this is moving, but timely review and help wherever Flynn can use it would be great because it benefits us all as a project. Support features. This one, I've actually approved this one, I think, if I remember correctly. Yes, but I'm just looking for someone else or some other people to approve
I will review
or
this
voice
today.
concern. So yeah, but I think that one's in good shape. It is, I do want to highlight as much as I can, this is a breaking change. If you have not guarded your controller and you are writing the supported features, which is experimental only, but still, if you are doing that, be very careful. Take a look at this, understand your failure modes, just watch this specific change. That's all I'll say. So then back in TLS policy, I think given how short we are on time, this is probably deferred because I think conformance tests are still in progress. Is that correct, Candace? I haven't seen any yet.
Yes, they're still in progress, and I'm going to be out of pocket for 2 weeks starting Wednesday, so it won't be anything that's completed within by the end of July.
Yeah, cool.
Is it
Well,
just
enjoy the time off.
Unfortunate.
Is it just the conformance tests? Because I might be able to help out.
So we need conformance tests, and then we need proof that 3+ implementations can pass them. I think we have at least 2, maybe 3 implementations. I don't know. I think we have 3 implementations. So maybe it is conformance tests and then just making sure.
Can you
So
put
yeah.
the implementations in the list at some point later?
Yes. I know we have that.
Sorry,
down
can you repeat that?
I think Dave's just looking for the implementations that implement this today.
Yeah.
I think it was
Contour
Contour.
is one.
I think Envoy Gateway, if I remember correctly.
Envoy Gateway, I think it does as well. But do they have new changes? Because I thought there was some renaming happening of fields.
Yeah, so I know at least one of them did V1 Alpha 3, like that's the newest one. I think there might be 2 on V1 Alpha 3, but maybe not a third yet. Need to do a little bit of checking. And if anyone out on the call knows offhand, that's great too. Yeah.
Great. Candace, I'll ping you tomorrow then about this.
Cool.
Also, Whitney on my team is
Okay.
planning to help with conformance test for this. I believe she's already been in touch with Candace, so I'll connect you as well.
Oh, awesome. Thanks.
Cool.
I think Whitney's here, and I have been in contact with her about it.
Cool.
Yes, I'm here, and I will be picking it up this week as well.
Cool. Well, hey,
Awesome.
maybe this isn't quite as deferred, so I'll move this back to needs work category. We'll see. Hopefully. Thank you. Backend protocol selection. I think this is already into, I mean, this is complete. I mean, we're just waiting for docs.
Yes,
So
it's
thanks,
yes.
Dave. TLS route deferred, in-cluster gateway. This just needs review again. I've added some comments, but this really needs some review from somebody who owns in-cluster implementations, who's working on them, and can vouch for if this makes sense or not. I'm just adding review as a interested outsider, I guess I could say, but I am not working on implementation that would test this.
I'll add that to my list for today too, because Vasilium does support it.
Cool. Okay, so this is just an informational thing I wanted to throw out there. Thank you, John, for doing this. This has been a pain for a good minute that we only had 8 matches for each route rule inside HP route, and I think same for gRPC route. And John came up with a horrific but wonderful cell expression to basically ensure the max number of matches still was 128. So the size of the route is no larger, but it means that you could have up to 64 of those matches in a single rule. So what this does is it alleviates what had been Nick and my concern for ages of we can't let these resources get any bigger than we've already allowed, while still letting the very real use cases of I want to be able to write, 10 different matches, or I want to be able to write for each of the different methods, different matcher for whatever that is, right? Yeah, there are some very real use cases here. So thank you, John. This is gross, but there was a bug in cell cost estimation that required this kind of very manual approach until the fix is more broadly available. So thank you for the creative solution here. This has approval in LGTM. It just not to pick on you, Nick, but I know you have strong opinions.
Yep, no,
here, so
yeah,
I just
that
wanna merge
yeah,
out.
this is high on my list to review today.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. This is mine, but I'm gonna drop it to the bottom because there are other things to discuss. So Caleb, I see some conformance stuff that looks cool. And Stephen, get hippie. I don't know who's on this call specifically.
Yeah, we're all here.
Cool.
Yeah, just from the discussion from the last meeting, thank you so much for all of your kind words and thoughts on how things could be. And I had made this ticket here, if you wouldn't mind jumping into that. It's regarding adding user agent information to each test that's run. And I've got some examples of how it could look like with that branch down below. And then also how the Kubernetes conformance tests end up changing. They pretty much create a new client set every time that a test is run. Not the prettiest code, but it does inject all of the correct data, and it can be very much tidied up. But I just wanted to get the point across. Here's how things could be for making sure that we get all of the correct data plumbed through to all the way eventually to gateway dash API dot API snip.io. And yeah, I was just wondering if there's any thoughts or any ways that we would be able to please get some support on this. And yeah, here to support you guys, you folks.
Cool. Yeah, no, this is very creative. I like this idea actually. So you're combining both the test name and the feature names that test is covering. And yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, this is very
Yeah,
cool. And do you
it feels like a pretty minimal change that will mean that we can end up with a really, really great coverage on API Snoop, which will sort of, with apologies to Christine, will make it even easier for people, for us to do sort of, to generate the sort of the feature matrices and stuff like that, because we'll have like the we'll have the API Snoop stuff to say, hey, which implementation do you want, and you have all that data there. I love it.
Yeah, this is awesome. Do you have an example of, like, once we include this user agent, what the result would look like? I think this is still the older approach of just looking at the API endpoints, like we're reading gateways or patching gateways.
Correct. Yeah. Some great work that Steve and I have been collaborating on is exactly what you had described last week, but it's just not published anywhere yet. But just imagine the beautiful world of standard and experimental, and then all of the features and all of the implementations around that.
Cool.
Yeah. So that
One thing that this will also
Yeah.
allow is a mapping between each of the tests and all of the endpoints that they hit, so that we can create a coverage map to go, well, this endpoint is hit an awful lot by most of the features, but these other can sometimes be 50% or not hit by anything. And so it helps you to give a deeper understanding of how the API is used by your functional tests, to show where you might have things that are generally available, and people do, once it's GA, people use it. And so you might not have test coverage for these things. And I know the Kubernetes community was quite surprised to see the lack of coverage on things that people depend on. And when you start to remove them or turn them off, you get a lot of feedback from humans going, wait, that
Yeah.
This is, that's all too real. Thank you a million times. I'm so interested in seeing how this turns out. I mean, from my take, if you want to turn that issue into a PR, I'm game. I don't see any issue with it. I'm just excited about where this is headed. Thank you all for doing some great work here.
Yes,
Caleb,
definitely.
will we need it just for the framework, or will we need it in each of the implementations of the test? Because I know you had some concerns around how the implementations have a test suite that's separate rather than a centralized test suite framework.
In the process of trying to get this data generated, as described from the previous meeting, ran into some roadblocks with different implementations having different, I guess, downstreams of the conformance test suite, which makes it really challenging to run the tests for, like, if I want to make a change to the upstream conformance test suite in the Gateway API repo, then it makes it challenging to, say, run for an implementation. I won't name drop here, but for different implementations that don't use the exact suite as per the Gateway API repo. And I understand, like, sometimes you got to set up things in a particular way, but yeah, making sure that if we get this change through, that all of the implementations will have that change as soon as possible to make it super seamless to get everything across the line as quickly as possible.
Speaking for an implementation that does use its own wrapper, yes, we will make sure that we update this. I think that part of this change should also be, we may need to update the implementer's guide to say, hey, when you do your performance testing, you need to make sure that you're doing the following set of steps. So we do have an implementer's guide that lists a bunch of stuff like that. I can show you where that is. And yeah, that's probably the right place to put this.
Yeah, and I would go so far as to say maybe we can allow or encourage implementations to provide some kind of snippet or whatever that's, if you run this is the setup required to run my implementation with the core conformance tests that are in tree, without any kind of, like, just a generic setup function. I don't know what that is, right? But that one of the things that has always been a pain for us reviewing conformance tests is that we haven't had a standard way to just say, I want to run this against, Contour, Cilium, Istio, whoever, right? So if implementations could provide that optionally, maybe that makes a few things easier. So yeah, this is great. I'm looking forward to what's next. Don't hesitate to ping anyone. I guess Nick is probably closer to your time zone, but I'm happy to help too whenever I can. So yeah. But with that, I know we're time scoped here. So Norwin, I think you're next. You want to talk a bit about namespace scope implementations.
Yes, thanks for bringing up the topic in today's meeting. So I'm quite new to the Gateway API, and I stumbled across this old issue. I think it was raised 3 years ago. It was when we decided if we should implement Gateway API or if we should move to something else. This was one of the big points, and I saw that there's a lot of discussions around the topic, and there are also already several suggestions how you can solve it. There also exist many workarounds, so some of these suggestions don't even need to change the API. But I think there is, as the issue pops up and gets followed over and over again, I think there is a need for having at least a pattern provided in the standard that suggests the way how you can support namespace scope deployments. And the easiest thing is to just have these static well-known classes that implementation specific are then treated as let's say like a default gateway class, or you can have, let's say, a namespace scoped resource similar as the gateway class, or just having headless gateways without gateway class. So I would be interested in what are your opinions, and maybe you can add them to the issue. And I'm also willing to follow up the topic and then moving it further, because for us it's kind of an important topic, and if it's solved or at least suggests a solution, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this back up. As you can tell by the thread, it has been a long and ongoing discussion, and eventually ran out of steam. But certainly if we have more people with real use cases that are looking to push that forward, that would be great. I would be really interested. Maybe if you want to leave a comment on that issue, as kind of, actually, it looks like you have added a comment. Thank you. But yeah, if you want to describe your use case in a little bit more detail, it looks like you have to a point. Yeah, I'm not sure. Not sure what's best here, but it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, at least these, like, for example, this static well-known classes option is something like that would work for you, but you would prefer the headless gateway option. So maybe understanding why that option is your preference and what makes it preferable.
Can I have a guess here, based on discussions that we have here, Norman, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So previously, when we've had discussions about this, people have said, I hate having to have that an implementation has to install something at cluster scope in order to be able to work. I want to be able to install an implementation into a namespace and have it only do stuff in that namespace. And that's cool, but like the problem is, from an API level, we don't have a way, like having a way that you can say this implementation only cares about gateway in this namespace is difficult, because the reason that we have because the whole API is designed so that, yes, you can have multiple multiple implementations running in a cluster. And the reason that we have, but for generally your implementation will need to watch things across the entire cluster, regardless of whether or not it writes anything or actually operates on anything that's not in that same namespace, because because we allow, by default, we allow you to make routes across namespaces between, you can go across namespace between gateways and routes. So you can't just unless you substantially limit the subset of functionality, you can't say, hey, you can just do it in one namespace. And then once you can cross one namespace, now you have a set of namespaces. Once you have a set of namespaces, your thing needs to be able to know like what things are valid in that set of namespaces. But we don't have an easy way to say, there's no set of namespaces scope in Kubernetes. So you're either in one namespace or you're in all the namespaces. There's no sort of API construct level that we can put a thing that you define a set of namespaces and then operate on that set of namespaces. And so from a purely API design point of view, like this is why we're stuck with the sort of the cluster scope gateway class thing. Now, I agree that it would be really nice to have a thing where you can install 10 implementations in a cluster and have them not have to create any cluster scoped things. Every one of the workarounds you have there have trade-offs, right? Like, and the thing that's really important here is that we have an understanding of what people actually want to achieve, like not the solution. The solution is not important. The use case that you are trying to solve is important here because that affects which trade-offs we pick. Like if the use case is, hey, I want to be able to install 10 implementations in a cluster and have none of them need to have cluster scoped access to anything, then that's different than hey, I want to be able than other reasons, right? Like I suspect that most people, that's what most people want, right? They're like, I want to be able to delegate to application developers the ability to install an ingress controller, a gateway API controller in an arbitrary namespace and not have any crossover with other things. I would argue that when you do that, you do have crossover with other things because of the domain, the fact that domain name allocation operates a cluster scope, unavoidably. You do have that. And so like the fact that you're like, oh, but I don't want to have to create any cluster scope resources, is you're building yourself a problem because you have a cluster scope resource that now has no API representation. So Norman, if you could just confirm for me that that is the main end use case you're talking about, then we need to go to Mike for his thoughts.
Yes, so there are two main use cases. One you mentioned is kind of letting controllers run without cluster scoped privileges, so having them with least privileges running in a isolated namespace. Another use case is also having the same gateway run with different versions in order to test certain outbreak scenarios. So having the same gateway controller watching only part of the namespaces. And I already saw in some implementation you have namespace filters in it. I don't know, I think in Istio there is a namespace filter where you can then filter the watch namespaces. And what you're describing is also the general issue with multi-tenancy and operators you have on OpenShift, on Kubernetes in general. But yeah, it goes in that direction.
Yeah, so if I mean, having thanks Mike for calling out that the network policy is starting to work on set of namespaces. We are over time, so yes, I know. So yeah, like I just want to say though that like I am happy to talk more about this, but like I trust me that like if there was an easy way to solve this, we would have solved it in the 3-4 years since we opened this issue. There is no easy way to solve this. No matter what solution we pick, we are going to break something, right? Like we're going to do something that's stupid, right? Like that's why we haven't done anything else here, right? Like and you can argue that we have the same problem right now. So
yeah, sorry, I gotta drop, but real quickly, if anyone's interested in routing to AI workloads, ping me. I've been looking into this and possible intersections with Gateway. But yes, thank you for a good discussion. I've got to run. If anyone wants to stick around, feel free, but I gotta run. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.